everybody, and welcome to this video, which is based on question 5 on paper 2 of the AQA GCSE English language exam. This video is going to focus on how you structure a writing to argue or writing to express a viewpoint paragraph. Okay, so hopefully you've watched my overview of this question, also my video on writing types and my video on writing format. And this is the final video in this overview series. Okay, so I'm just going to go through how you need to structure your paragraphs in order to show that you have considered the other side of the argument. So when you are expressing your own point of view, obviously you want to hammer home that point of view to your reader. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is get your reader, or try and persuade your reader to agree with you. And that's what the examiner wants to see, how you express your viewpoint. And you can do that using a series of logical arguments, okay? But you also need to consider the opposite side of the argument. So what a person who has an opposite viewpoint or has a differing viewpoint from you would think, okay? So you need to think of what we call your counter argument. Now, some students always say, well, why would I want to, put down my opposition's point of view when actually mine is the most important? Well, because it shows that you are the kind of person who weighs up the alternatives. So the examiner wants to see that you've sat there and you've actually considered both sides of the argument and you've come to the conclusion on one side, depending on how many arguments you've got for and against. So you've actually sat there, thought it through. You haven't just gone with one side and thought it's easier to write that, okay? So it shows that you're intelligent enough to assess all the options. So when it comes to planning for this question, you could easily just do a T plan like this. Write down your arguments, okay? So if you've got your point of view, think about the arguments that you've got for your point of view. 5 is a good number, but also consider what the counter argument to those points is as well. So you've almost kind of got to second guess what somebody would say to you if you were sat across a table from them and you were having a debate about the question. Okay, what would your opposition say? Okay, what would they say to you to try and persuade you to feel their way? Okay, so it's about considering the counter argument as well as your arguments. Now, the way I would structure a point of view paragraph is like this, and I call it tennis match paragraphs. And the reason I call it that is because you're literally batting the ball back and forth. So I would start at the beginning of your point of view paragraph. I would start with your point of view. At the end of the day, your point of view is the most important. So you need to start your paragraph with what your argument is. Okay, so this paragraph was based on a question that focused on whether the age rating on violent video games should be reduced. So I took the stance of that it should be reduced. I thought it was more interesting to argue that way. And I thought about one of the reasons as to why the age rating should be reduced. So I started with another reason for reducing the age rating is that the number of teenagers who are not affected far outweigh the number who do exhibit violent tendencies. So I say what my point is at the beginning of my paragraph. Then you bat the ball across to your opposition and you mention the counter argument, okay? So you need to use a counter argument discourse marker. And here I've said, whilst many people believe that playing violent video games during the tender teenage years increases the likelihood of violent outbursts, I have to disagree with their argument, okay? So if you see, I've literally just written a sentence explaining what the counter argument is. And then I say, have these people ever played video games? How have they come to this conclusion, one must ask, okay? So I've actually used rhetorical questions to explain or suggest to the reader that perhaps that counter argument is silly, okay? And here, this is where I develop my argument. So you bat the ball back over to your side and you put more detail onto the argument that you've got, okay? So I write, as a teenager myself, I often partake in an after-school video game session and fully enjoy the escapism they offer following an arduous day of testing and questioning. Okay, so I'm building on that point that actually the benefits of playing these games far outweigh the negative side, okay? Then I've included a fact. Indeed, a recent survey at our school revealed that 80% of students regularly play video games, which involve material of an adult nature. Yet these students don't wield knives or violently abuse fellow students or staff. So you can see I've made up a fact there. I've used rhetorical questions, and those linguistic techniques and that development of my argument, the point that I made at the beginning of the paragraph, really hammers home the point that I'm making, that the reader should agree with me, okay? Always finish on your point of view. That's the most important. Now, if you look at the weighting of that paragraph, you'll see that my argument takes up the majority of that paragraph. Okay, the counter argument is just a little smidge in the middle. It's almost like a sandwich, okay? So you've got your bread and then your filling is it's almost like a margarine layer. So it's a thin margarine layer of counter argument. So your point of view and your argument is going to make up the majority of that tennis match paragraph. So the structure of your overall answer is going to look something like this. You're going to have an introduction, okay, whether you have to write an article, a letter, a speech, a leaflet or an essay. You need an introduction, and that needs to be an impact statement. So it needs to hammer home what your point of view is from the outset. Now, I always tell my students to start off with a rhetorical question because I think that's a really good way of getting a linguistic device in straight away, and it's really good to get your reader considering your point of view, okay? So if you are writing a letter, your introduction, you could put a rhetorical question. For a leaflet or an article, then your rhetorical question could be a headline. If you're writing an essay, it will come into your introduction. And if it's the text for a speech, then after you've addressed your audience, then you can use a rhetorical question then. Then what will happen with your answer is you will have a number of body paragraphs depending on how much you can write in the time. So these will be your tennis match paragraphs, okay? So you have to acknowledge the counter argument, but you have to smash the opposition's point of view, okay? So those body paragraphs will be the tennis match paragraphs. And then you need a conclusion, okay? Obviously, depending on what you are writing, that conclusion will either come before you write yours faithfully, if it's a letter. If it's an article, then it will just have a conclusion at the end. If it's a speech, then obviously this impact statement will come before you say thank you for listening, okay? So that impact statement needs to leave your reader with the clear impression of what your point of view is, okay? So you need to make it clear that the reader has to go away and support your point of view. Okay, so that is the final video on question 5 for now. Okay, please subscribe to the channel. I will be adding updates for the paper 1 and paper 2 English language papers. Please follow me on Twitter at AQA Exams. If you've got any questions, then you can tweet me over on there. If you pop the hashtag AskMissW, then that makes it really great for everybody else because they can follow that frequently asked questions Twitter feed. Thank you ever so much for listening. Hope to speak to you soon.